He built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, trusted no one, and loved only once. But everything Jonathan Hale thought he knew about his past, his future, even himself, shattered the night he saw a silver bracelet on the wrist of a 6-year-old boy who looked exactly like him. And that boy wasn't alone. There were 3 of them. Identical. Laughing. Alive. And they all had her eyes. Jonathan Hale had closed billion-dollar deals with less thought than he gave to the wine list that night. Seated in his usual corner of Le Pierre, a sleek and quiet Manhattan restaurant where power dressed in tailored suits and whispered over Wagyu, he was every inch the image he'd crafted, precise, untouchable, composed. His watch cost more than some of his employees' salaries. His phone buzzed every few seconds with updates from markets across the globe. He answered none of them. He didn't need to. Everything ran exactly as he intended. His life was a clockwork mechanism: wake at 4:30, train with a personal coach, take 5 strategic calls before breakfast, dominate meetings, manage egos, review acquisitions, impress investors, rinse, repeat. Nothing surprised him anymore. He'd engineered a life where emotion had no place, where memory was a liability, where past and future were just coordinates on a profit graph. Haley Brooks had been the only variable. The only unsolvable equation. And 6 years ago, she vanished. No confrontation, no drama. One evening she kissed him softly, said she needed air, and by morning her apartment was empty and her number disconnected. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. Not to friends, what few he kept, not to therapists he didn't believe in, not to the mirror that looked more tired every year. She was archived. Like an old file stored away in his brain's hard drive. Closed. Until that night. As the waiter poured his wine, Jonathan's eyes drifted beyond the flicker of candlelight to a family seated just across the room. He hadn't noticed them enter. 3 little boys sat at a table too big for them, their legs swinging from the high chairs. Identical faces. Same messy dark hair, same mischievous grin, the same storm-colored eyes, a color Jonathan recognized with a strange, bone-deep certainty. His own eyes. His own childhood smile. They looked to be around 6. He blinked. Once. Twice. Tried to dismiss it as a trick of lighting or his imagination finally rebelling against a too predictable life. But then one of the boys reached for his soda, and Jonathan saw it, the bracelet. A thin, silver band around the child's small wrist. It was simple, almost unremarkable, but he knew it instantly. The inside of the band was engraved. He didn't need to see it to recall what it said. To my love, forever. He'd given that bracelet to Haley the last night he saw her. It was his first and only sentimental gift. She'd laughed when he gave it to her, said it was too poetic for a man who lived by numbers and ledgers. But she wore it. Every day. Until she disappeared. The waiter asked if he was ready to order, but Jonathan didn't hear him. His gaze was fixed, breath caught somewhere between shock and something deeper, something jagged and unfamiliar. He stood up slowly, leaving the untouched wine and the empty chair behind. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to get closer. The air around him felt warped, charged, like time had folded in on itself. He crossed the room as though walking through water. He didn't care how it looked. He wasn't thinking of his image or the eyes that followed him. All he could see were 3 boys who shared his face. And one bracelet that should have been lost to the past. The boys were laughing, trading bites of their food and whispering secrets only 6-year-olds could understand, while the woman with them, an older lady with tired eyes and a kind, lined face, cut their pizza into smaller pieces. She moved with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had done this 1,000 times. There was no sign of a mother, no other adult in sight. Jonathan stood a few feet away, frozen. Logic told him to turn back, to let it go, to chalk it up to coincidence, but his instincts refused to obey. He couldn't take his eyes off the bracelet, or off the boys who looked too much like him for this to be chance. After a moment, the older woman noticed him staring. She straightened slightly, protective, unsure. Her hand reached instinctively toward the boy with the bracelet, resting lightly on his shoulder. Jonathan stepped forward and spoke before he could stop himself. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he expected. I saw the bracelet. Where did he get that?" He nodded toward the boy, trying not to sound like a lunatic, though he knew how he must have looked, a stranger in $1,000 suit asking about a child's jewelry. The woman studied him, eyes narrowing. "It was his mother's," she said after a pause. Her voice was cautious. "She gave it to him before she died." Jonathan's breath hitched. A tremor moved through him like an aftershock. "What was her name?" he asked, though he already knew. He needed to hear it. The woman hesitated, then answered quietly. "Haley. Haley Brooks." He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and everything around him blurred. The restaurant faded, the chatter, the clinking glasses. All that remained was the echo of a name he hadn't said out loud in years. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him more carefully now, not just wary but thoughtful. "You knew her?" Jonathan nodded. "I loved her," he said. "We were close." The words felt inadequate. They didn't cover the truth of who Haley had been to him, or what her disappearance had cost him. The woman's expression shifted subtly, and something like realization dawned in her eyes. Her grip on the boy's shoulder loosened. "You're Jonathan," she said slowly. "She told me about you." "Not much, but enough." He took a shaky breath. "Are they mine?" The question hung between them, electric, unbearable. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the boys, now busy arguing over whose turn it was to choose dessert. She seemed to weigh something silently, measuring his face, his voice, the emotion he was trying so hard to hide. Then she nodded once, very slightly. "Yes," she said. "They're yours." Jonathan staggered back half a step. He had imagined this moment in quiet, half-formed dreams over the years, in what-ifs he never dared finish. But this wasn't a dream. It was happening, and he didn't know what to do with the flood rising inside him. They were his. And he had never known. "How?" he asked. "Why didn't she tell me?" The woman looked down. Her voice softened, touched with sadness. "She wanted to. I think she almost did, once. But she was scared." "You'd made your choice," she said. "The company, the empire. She didn't want to drag you into her quiet life, or risk being another person you left behind." Jonathan wanted to argue, to protest, to say he would have chosen differently, but the truth lodged in his throat like a stone. Maybe he wouldn't have. Not then. "I need to see them again," he said quietly, desperately. "Please." The woman hesitated. "They don't know you," she warned. "Not really. They know a name, and a story their mother told. But that's it." "Then let me change that," he said, and for the first time in years, Jonathan Hale didn't sound like a man in control. He sounded like a man trying to reclaim something he never should have lost. Later that evening, the woman, her name was Margaret, agreed to let him visit their temporary apartment. She didn't trust him fully, not yet, but something in his voice must have convinced her he wasn't lying, or maybe it was the unmistakable way the boys had looked at him with subtle confusion, as if something inside them already knew. The building was modest, tucked into a quiet street in Queens. It was the kind of place Haley might have chosen, unassuming, peaceful, real. Jonathan had never set foot in a neighborhood like this. Not since college, and even then only briefly. He felt out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes, a monument of corporate power standing awkwardly in a world built on simplicity. The apartment was small but clean. The boys had already gone to bed by the time they arrived, though Margaret let him peek into their room. 3 little beds lined up side by side, each with their own chaos, a toy dinosaur with a missing leg, a superhero blanket hanging halfway to the floor, a nightlight shaped like the moon. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching the soft rise and fall of their breathing, trying to make sense of the weight in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he had stood so still for so long. Margaret motioned for him to follow her into the living room. She brought out a box from the closet, weathered, taped on the sides, clearly opened and resealed many times. She kept everything, Margaret said, placing it gently on the table. Photos, letters, little things. She didn't want them to forget. And she didn't want you erased, even if you weren't there. Jonathan sat slowly, his fingers brushing over the edges of the box like it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Inside were pieces of a life he never knew he had. Photographs, dozens of them, Haley in a sundress, laughing in a sunlit park, holding a baby who looked just like him. Then 2 babies. Then 3. Their first birthdays, Halloween costumes, crayon drawings signed with names he had never spoken aloud. Alex. Max, Tim. There were letters too. Some addressed to the boys, some to no one at all. One began, "If you're reading this, maybe I'm gone, and maybe he's finally come looking for you." He couldn't finish it. His eyes burned. He closed the letter and reached for the bracelet instead, the same one he'd seen at the restaurant, now resting beside a photo of Haley holding all 3 boys in her lap. She looked tired but radiant. Fulfilled. "She talked about you sometimes," Margaret said, watching him with a strange mix of gentleness and gravity. Not with anger. Not even regret. Just longing. "She said you had a hard time trusting love, but that you loved her in the only way you knew how. She believed you would have been a good father, if you'd known." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I should have known. I should have seen it. I spent years building a world that felt invincible, and somehow I missed the most important part of it." Margaret nodded slowly. "You can't change the past. But you can decide what kind of future you want with them. They're good boys. Smart. Sensitive. They miss her more than they know how to say. And they need someone who sees them." He looked down at the photo in his hands. 3 lives. Half his blood. Entirely unknown to him until tonight. And still, there was a strange and immediate sense of belonging, like something broken inside him had shifted slightly, not healed, but cracked open. There was a chance now, a narrow, difficult, and undeserved chance, to make something right. "I want to be there for them," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how. I have no idea what I'm doing. But I want to try." Margaret didn't smile, but her expression softened. "Then you'd better start learning. Because they've already lost one parent. Don't make them lose another." The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the apartment just as the boys were waking up. The door creaked open and 3 small heads peeked out from their bedroom, blinking at the sudden light and at the tall stranger standing in the hallway. They didn't speak. They simply stared, curious, cautious, unsure whether he was real or just another adult who came and went like so many others. Margaret introduced him gently, calling him Mr. Jonathan, for now, explaining that he had known their mother, that he wanted to spend some time with them. The boys nodded, not fully understanding but not rejecting the idea either. Children had an uncanny way of sensing hidden truths, and though they couldn't articulate it, something about the man felt familiar, his eyes, maybe, or the way his voice dropped just slightly when he said Haley's name. They sat in the kitchen eating cereal, 3 spoons clinking in unison, while Jonathan stood near the counter, his posture too formal for such an ordinary room. He didn't know how to enter their world. They talked to each other in half-sentences and shared jokes he didn't understand. Every now and then one of them would glance at him quickly, then look away. It was Alex, the oldest by 5 minutes, according to Margaret, who finally broke the silence. "Did you know our mom when she was alive?" he asked without looking up from his bowl. Jonathan's heart stuttered. "Yes," he said softly. "I knew her a long time ago. She was very important to me. Alex nodded like he was filing the answer away for later. Max and Tim didn't say much, but Tim slid his empty bowl toward Jonathan wordlessly, waiting to see what he'd do. Jonathan took it, unsure whether this was a test or just a habit, and rinsed it out in the sink. Tim seemed satisfied and wandered back to the living room with a toy car in hand. Later, they went to the park together. The sun had broken through a cloudy sky, casting a soft glow over the wet pavement and rustling trees. The boys ran ahead while Jonathan stayed close behind with Margaret, who watched them like a hawk even while giving them space to roam. He tried not to be obvious about how intently he observed them, how they moved, how they laughed, how they called out to each other with such effortless connection. Each one was so clearly his and yet so wildly individual. Alex was quiet but always watching. Max had energy that buzzed in every limb, constantly in motion. Tim was softer, prone to daydreaming, happiest when he could sit and build things out of sticks and stones. Jonathan felt like a visitor in a country he used to belong to but had long since forgotten how to speak the language. He tried joining their game on the swings but struggled to keep up. They didn't mock him, just giggled and ran ahead again. Still, they didn't push him away. That was something. That evening, when he returned home to his empty penthouse, the silence was unbearable. The rooms were pristine, untouched, filled with glass and chrome and everything expensive, yet it all felt artificial. He stood in his designer kitchen with the lights off and thought about the sound of 3 bowls clinking together, the weight of Tim's small bowl in his hand, the way Alex's question had hung in the air like a challenge. Unable to sleep, he called his assistant and instructed her to clear his schedule indefinitely. Meetings, board reviews, travel, everything. He didn't tell her why, just that it was urgent and personal. She didn't ask questions. No one ever did. The next day, he went back to Queens. And the day after that. And the day after that. The visits became routine. He would show up in the morning, walk them to school with Margaret, pick them up in the afternoon, try to help with homework even when he didn't understand what kind of math 6-year-olds were doing these days. He read to them before bed, sometimes stumbling over the voices, sometimes getting it right enough to make them laugh. At first, it felt like he was performing, auditioning for a role he didn't deserve. But slowly, something began to shift. They started asking him questions. They let him sit closer. Max invited him into his blanket fort. Tim drew a picture of the 4 of them and handed it to him without a word. Alex still didn't say much, but one night, as Jonathan was tucking them in, he looked up and asked, "Why didn't you come before?" Jonathan didn't lie. He didn't pretend. He just knelt beside the bed and answered with the truth, even though it burned. "Because I didn't know you existed. And because I wasn't ready to be the kind of person your mom deserved. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Alex looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly and pulled the blanket up over his head. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something close. Jonathan had always believed that excellence came from control of time, money, image, outcomes. But nothing about being a father could be controlled, at least not in the way he was used to. There were no metrics, no quarterly reports, no formulas to calculate how much a child would trust you. The boys challenged him in ways he had never experienced, not with defiance but with their raw honesty, their need for consistency, their sudden silences that said more than words ever could. He had stepped into their lives quietly, uncertainly, and now found himself caught between who he had been and who he was desperately trying to become. He moved into a modest apartment 3 blocks from Margaret's, determined to be nearby without overwhelming them. Every morning, he showed up with breakfast, sometimes a little too fancy, like croissants from a French bakery they didn't care about, but he was learning. Pancakes worked better. Cereal with the marshmallows they liked. Juice boxes instead of pressed juice. He was learning to speak their language, not just through words but through gestures, through being present. Helping with homework turned into an exercise in humility. Tim liked drawing animals with human names and wanted Jonathan to sit beside him and invent stories. Max needed someone to listen to his theories about space and dinosaurs and how they might be connected. Alex, guarded as ever, asked questions that felt more like emotional puzzles. Why did Mom always wear that old sweater when she was sad? Did you ever make her laugh? And Jonathan answered every one with as much truth as he could offer, even when it made him ache. He read parenting books late at night, watched old videos of Haley that Margaret eventually shared, tried to mimic the gentle firmness she had in her voice, the way she crouched to their eye level, the way she laughed freely, without fear of being misunderstood. He had missed the years where they took their first steps, said their first words, lost their first teeth, but he refused to miss anything more. Not if he could help it. One Saturday, he brought them to the Natural History Museum. It was chaos. Max sprinted from exhibit to exhibit, dragging Jonathan behind him while explaining the difference between meteors and asteroids. Tim was fascinated by the giant whale but scared of the dinosaur bones, and Alex refused to take a photo with them, though he held Jonathan's hand longer than usual as they walked through the halls. They ended the day with ice cream on the steps outside, their faces sticky and tired, and Jonathan realized he was smiling without even trying. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real. And that was something he hadn't felt in years. There were still hard days. Times when the boys asked about Haley and their faces folded into expressions too heavy for their age. Times when Jonathan said the wrong thing or forgot how fragile their trust still was. Once, during a small argument over bedtime, Alex shouted, "You're not Mom. You don't get to decide," and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. Jonathan had stood on the other side, heart pounding, unsure whether to knock or walk away. In the end, he slid a note under the door, "You're right. I'm not. But I'm trying to learn. I love you. Good night." The door didn't open, but the next morning, Alex handed him the note back with the words, "Okay," written in crooked letters at the bottom. They began calling him Dad without fanfare. One day Tim said it accidentally and didn't correct himself. Max said it next, louder, to test how it felt. Alex waited a few weeks, then used it softly while asking for help with a project. Jonathan didn't comment on it. He didn't need to. The word settled between them like a small, living thing, delicate, but growing. Every night before bed, they asked for a story. Jonathan didn't know many, so he started telling them stories about their mother, the way she used to dance in the kitchen while burning toast, how she once got lost in Central Park for an hour because she refused to ask for directions, how she cried the first time she saw snow after moving to New York. He spoke of her with reverence, not because she was gone, but because her presence was still so real in everything they did. And in those stories, the boys learned not just about her, but about him. Jonathan was no longer the man who ruled boardrooms with silence and fear. He was someone who sat cross-legged on the floor building Lego towers at 7 a.m., someone who knew each boy's favorite snack and which nightlight needed new batteries, someone who held their drawings like they were stock certificates. He hadn't earned their love with grand gestures or promises. He was earning it, slowly, by being there. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to build something that truly mattered. It had been nearly 4 months since Jonathan first saw the boys in that restaurant, and while nothing about his journey into fatherhood had been easy, it had started to feel like his life had finally found a rhythm, imperfect, exhausting, beautiful. The boys no longer looked at him with hesitation. They called him Dad now, sometimes in moments so casual it made his chest tighten with quiet joy. Margaret had become more than a guide, she was a lifeline, a bridge to Haley's memory and the steady ground beneath the children's lives. Things weren't perfect, but for the first time in years, Jonathan believed they were moving in the right direction. Then Jack showed up. Jonathan first heard the name in a conversation with Margaret one evening as they were folding laundry in her kitchen. She said it carefully, like she was holding something sharp in her mouth. "Haley's brother. Jack. I haven't seen him in years, but he called me today. He said he heard rumors, about you, about the boys. I think someone told him there might be money involved now. Jonathan had gone still. He remembered Jack only vaguely, from years ago, loud, impulsive, always looking for the easy way out. Haley rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a tone somewhere between regret and fear. He's not stable, Margaret said quietly. But he's family. And that matters in court. A week later, Jack filed for custody. The news hit Jonathan like a punch to the chest. The idea of someone else claiming the right to raise his sons, especially someone who hadn't shown up for a single moment of their lives, was enraging, but also terrifying. And Jack didn't just want custody. He wanted headlines. He showed up to court in a cheap suit, flanked by a lawyer who was far too polished for someone without a job. He gave interviews to local news outlets claiming Jonathan had stolen his nephews, manipulating the system with his wealth, painting himself as a grieving uncle who just wanted to honor his sister's memory. The story exploded. It didn't matter that Jack had no history with the boys, or that he had been in and out of rehab for most of the past decade. The media loved the scandal. Billionaire CEO hides secret children, fights shady uncle for custody. Overnight, Jonathan's name was dragged through every gossip blog and cable news channel. Hailtech's board panicked. Shareholders were furious. Sponsors began to pull out of deals. The company's value plummeted, and with it, Jonathan's influence. He was summoned to an emergency board meeting. The tone was cold, clinical, impersonal. They expressed concern about his public distractions and instability. They didn't ask about the boys. They didn't ask how he was doing. They simply suggested, then demanded, that he take an indefinite leave, or step down. He chose neither. Instead, he walked out, his resignation letter emailed that night with a single sentence: "I have more important things to fight for." The legal battle dragged on. Court hearings were tense and filled with pointed questions. Jonathan's past, his workaholism, his emotional detachment, his reputation as a ruthless businessman, was brought up repeatedly. Jack sat in the courtroom like he was auditioning for a movie, nodding solemnly, wearing a cross he hadn't worn before, spinning stories about promises he'd made to Haley that no one could verify. Jonathan, by contrast, didn't try to be perfect. He told the truth. That he hadn't known about the boys. That he had made mistakes. That he was still learning. What turned the tide wasn't evidence or strategy. It was the testimony of the boys. One by one, they were brought in, carefully, gently, with therapists present. Max talked about their Saturday trips to the park and how Jonathan always carried extra snacks in his coat pocket. Tim brought a drawing he'd made of their family, with Jonathan standing in the middle, holding all their hands. But it was Alex who delivered the quiet blow that broke through the courtroom noise. When asked who he wanted to live with, he answered simply, "With my dad." He listens. He tries. He's not trying to be mom. He's just being him. Jonathan didn't cry. Not in court. But later, alone in the hallway outside, he did. The judge took several days to deliberate. Margaret stayed by his side, a steady presence, while the boys kept asking if they could go home, unaware of how close they were to having their world upended. Then, finally, the ruling came. Custody would remain with Jonathan, with oversight from family services for a year. Jack's petition was denied. There was no appeal. The courtroom cleared, but Jonathan stayed in his seat for a long time, the weight of the fight still pressing down on him. He had lost his company, his fortune, the identity he had worn like armor for years. But when he returned home that night and opened the front door to find 3 small bodies launching into his arms, all talking at once about school, about cartoons, about what was for dinner, he realized he hadn't lost everything. He had finally found something worth losing everything for. The weeks that followed the court ruling were a strange mixture of relief and aftermath. On paper, Jonathan had won. The boys were his, legally, completely. There would be check-ins from child services, yes, but that didn't scare him. What scared him more than anything, was the quiet that settled after the chaos. It was the silence left by a career that no longer existed, the absence of headlines, the echo of an identity he had built and then left behind. For most of his adult life, he had been Jonathan Hale, CEO, a name that opened doors and made people stand straighter when he entered a room. Now, he was just Dad, and though it was the name he'd learned to love the most, it came with a weight he wasn't always sure he could carry. He sold the penthouse. There was no need for it anymore, and besides, he hated how cold it felt now. He found a small house in the same neighborhood where Margaret lived, close to the boys' school, with a creaky porch and a backyard they could actually play in. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. The boys picked out paint colors for their rooms, argued over bunk beds versus separate beds, and insisted on putting up glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, even though Jonathan initially thought they were tacky. By the end of the week, his ceiling had more constellations than the real night sky, and he couldn't stop smiling every time he looked at them. He found himself struggling with simple things he'd never had to do before. Budgeting groceries. Helping with school projects that required glitter and glue guns. Scheduling dentist appointments. There were moments when he felt completely unequipped, like when Max got sick and threw up in the car, or when Tim cried for an hour straight after having a nightmare and wouldn't say what it was about. But there were also moments that made the chaos feel worth it. Quiet breakfasts where no one was in a rush. Weekend mornings spent building pillow forts in the living room. The sound of 3 voices yelling, "Dad," when he walked in the door after picking up dinner. Still, the shadow of everything he had left behind followed him in ways he hadn't expected. People whispered. Former colleagues avoided him in public. His name, once synonymous with innovation and strategy, now carried an undertone of scandal. Some news outlets called him reckless, others called him brave. He stopped caring what they called him altogether. But what he couldn't ignore was the look on Alex's face one day when he came home from school unusually quiet. That night, after the younger boys had gone to bed, Jonathan sat with Alex on the back steps, watching the sky begin to dim. "You okay?" he asked, not pushing, just asking. Alex shrugged. "A kid at school said you lost all your money." Jonathan let out a breath. "Yeah," he said honestly. "I did." Alex kicked at a stone with his shoe. "Are we poor now?" The question was simple, but the weight of it hit hard. Jonathan thought for a moment. "No. We're not poor. We don't have the same things we used to, but we have what we need. We have a home. We have each other. That's more than I had when I had all the money in the world." Alex nodded slowly, and after a few minutes, leaned his head against Jonathan's arm. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't have to. At night, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan would sometimes walk through the house in silence. In the hallway was a framed photo of Haley, the one Margaret had given him from the old box. She was holding all 3 boys, hair messy, smiling with the kind of tired joy that only came from deep love. On the table below it sat the silver bracelet. He had found a way to restore it and placed it in a glass case, no longer something hidden or lost, but honored. He thought about her often. What she would say if she saw all this. How she'd laugh at the disaster he'd made of their first science project. How she'd tease him for burning grilled cheese. How proud she might be. Not of the man he once was, but of the one he was becoming. One evening, Margaret stopped by for dinner. The boys were loud, messy, sticky with barbecue sauce, and proud of it. She looked around the chaos and smiled. "You look exhausted," she said, sipping her tea. "I am," Jonathan admitted. "You also look happy." He paused for a moment, looked around at the evidence of that truth, crumbs on the floor, a fort made of couch cushions in the corner, laughter echoing down the hallway. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." There was no boardroom waiting for him. No stock ticker climbing. No 5-year plan. But there was something better, an imperfect, vibrant, constantly moving life filled with the kind of noise that healed instead of harmed. He hadn't just stepped away from the world he once knew. He had stepped into something entirely new. Something real. Something worth every sacrifice he had made. Spring arrived gently that year, bringing with it the kind of quiet transformation Jonathan barely recognized until it was already in full bloom. The boys no longer needed him to prove anything. They no longer stared at him with cautious eyes or asked questions with invisible conditions behind them. They knew he would show up. They knew he would listen. And more importantly, they knew he would stay. The sharp edges of grief and uncertainty had softened into something steadier, something that held their little family together even on the hard days. There were still moments of sadness, especially when someone mentioned Haley, or when a memory snuck in through a scent or a song, but the sadness no longer swallowed them. It sat beside them, like a familiar guest, and they learned how to live with it. Jonathan had started a foundation in Haley's name, a small non-profit designed to help single mothers with housing, education, and childcare. He didn't make a show of it, didn't hold galas or pose for magazine covers. He worked quietly, building partnerships, funding programs, listening to women who had gone through what Haley had gone through alone. The work gave him a new kind of purpose, one that didn't revolve around quarterly earnings or market trends. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow, frustrating, humbling. But it mattered. At home, life was a symphony of small, imperfect joys. Max developed a fascination with maps and spent hours drawing entire cities on poster boards, complete with rivers and subway systems. Tim discovered baking and insisted on making Friday cookies every week, even when the dough ended up more on the counter than in the oven. Alex had taken up journaling in a worn leather notebook Margaret had given him, and while he never let Jonathan read it, he sometimes asked for help spelling harder words. The house buzzed with life, books scattered across the couch, toys in every corner, little shoes piled by the door. Jonathan had traded silence and order for this beautiful chaos, and he wouldn't have it any other way. One Saturday afternoon, the boys decided they wanted to make a short film. They wrote a script, cast themselves in various roles, and made Jonathan play the villain, which he performed with exaggerated flair, complete with a fake mustache made from tape and black yarn. Margaret filmed it on her phone, laughing so hard at one point she nearly dropped the camera. When it was done, they watched it on the TV like it was a real premiere, popcorn in bowls, the lights off, credits and all. After the credits rolled, the screen went dark, and for a moment, no one said anything. Then Tim whispered, "Mom would have loved this," and Jonathan felt his throat tighten in the best possible way. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, he sat alone in the living room. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling still shone faintly above him, and the sound of soft breathing echoed from the boys' rooms. On the wall hung the framed photo of Haley with the boys in her lap. Beneath it, the silver bracelet sat in its glass case, polished but untouched, resting on a wooden shelf he'd built with his own hands. It wasn't an altar. It was a promise that her love would never be forgotten, that her children were safe, that the life she wanted for them was finally becoming real. Jonathan had lost a world and found a better one. He had walked away from wealth, status, and certainty, and stepped into something more valuable than any of it. He had become a father not through perfection, but through presence. Through learning. Through staying. Through love. And as the moonlight filled the room and the silence settled in the most peaceful way, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He had already arrived. To me, the ending of this story isn't just about redemption, it's about real transformation. Jonathan didn't simply become a better man, he dismantled everything that once defined him and chose to rebuild a life around love instead of legacy. That's rare, and it's powerful. What struck me most is how the story refuses to offer an easy resolution. Haley is still gone. The pain doesn't disappear. The struggles of fatherhood and healing aren't magically solved, but they're met with honesty, vulnerability, and a quiet, steady courage. There's something incredibly moving about the idea that a man who once lived for control, wealth, and image would give it all up for messy kitchens, forgotten lunchboxes, and whispered bedtime stories. It reminds us that the richest life isn't the loudest or most admired, it's the one rooted in presence, in showing up day after day, especially when it's hard. That's the kind of happy ending that stays with you. Not perfect, but true.